All right, so rounding out this discussion of assessment, in the second section of the lesson plan template, that's where you're describing what your assessment is. Remember, the first section, that's your goals for student learning. Once you know your goals, which essentially your learning target is one of them, then you have to figure out your assessment, how you're going to determine if students met your learning target. So in the lesson plan template itself, there are two boxes. You see expectations for student learning, and then, you see evidence and assessment of student learning, and then expectations for student learning. So this first one, this is where you tell what your assessments are. So remember, you will always have a formative assessment, and you're going to describe it here. You will not always have a summative assessment. Going forward, when you're thinking more like unit plans, you can list what the summative assessment will be at the end of the unit. But for right now, because we're just getting started, just put in NA. I don't want you to get used to putting any blanks or leaving any blanks. So put NA for now. This first one, a diagnostic or a pre-assessment. Remember, to plan this lesson, you have to collect the data, right? So lots of times for me, my pre-assessment is the ticket out the door from the day before or a journal entry from the day before. So you can describe what it is, not what the data is, but just describe here, ticket out the door where students wrote the main idea. Literally, that's all you'd have to put right here. You have to acknowledge where you got the information to plan today's lesson. Then in the formative assessment, you're going to describe what it is students are going to do, right? And remember, this here has to align with your learning target. Those are two things I look for really closely. I read your learning target, then I come right here and I read what your formative assessment is. If they're not aligned, the lesson plan is not going to be well organized. So I look for that first. So anyway, those are the types of assessments. Now, you have said how you're going to assess at the end of the lesson. Well, now you have to give some kind of criteria to it. Remember when I told you about performance assessments? I told you there's the task and then the evaluation criteria. You have to know, but you have to know before you look at student work what you expect to see. So if your formative assessment is that students will write a paragraph about something, you need to be crystal clear what you'd want to see in that paragraph. And that's what you would put here. So anything that meets your expectations, that's where I start. Meets the expectations, that's what you want to include here. Then anything that would blow your mind that this is such an advanced student, you'd add it to up here. And then anything that would raise a red flag for you to say, oh, this student needs some reteaching, that's below your expectations. You describe it here. But really what you need to do is, again, I know I say alignment a lot, and I hope you don't get sick of me saying it, but it's so important. Whatever you say your formative assessment is, the expectations have to match it exactly. You cannot put things like students will stay on task, or students will complete the work by the end of the period, or students will collaborate appropriately. Those are all important things, but unless you listed those skills as what you're assessing, you can't include that here. Think of how unfair that is. This here, your formative assessment, is saying, what do you want students to do to show you they met the learning target? You can't list additional things here that you're not assessing for, like behavior, attention, organization, things like that. So keep that in mind. And the only assessment you're including criteria for is the formative assessment, right? Because that's happening at the end of the lesson. Okay? I hope that makes sense. So this is what one might look like. So in this lesson, the formative assessment is students will be asked to explain how claims are supported by reasons and evidence in the text. Students will be given a few blocks of text and asked to identify claims being made, identify and list the reasons and evidence used to support the claims. See how that's really described quite well? You know exactly what it is students are doing. And if you were to look back at the learning target, it would make total sense. This pre-assessment is very detailed because this came from like something that was actually planned. It's hard for us now when everything we're planning is hypothetical, but they just shared where, like, what the assessment was so that they know they could move on to today's lesson. And then you can see here on a unit test, there will be blah, 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 and it explains the unit test. But like I said, for us for now, this can be an NA. So now we know what the formative assessment is, right? They're going to read some text, identify the claims, and then give the reasons from the text to support the claims, right? So now we get to go and look at the criteria. And like I said, I always start with what meets my expectation. Oop. So what meets expectations, students identify at least 2 claims and list some of the evidence and reasons that support them made in a text and generally explain how reasons and evidence in the text are used to support the claims. I know that sounds really wordy, but think about what that says. The assessment just says that students are going to identify claims. Well, you expect to see 2 of them identified, right? And you would at least want to see some of the evidence and reasons from the text pulled out. It's not saying all, because this text might have a ton of extra information, and that's not really what you want. But see how clear that is? So then thinking about what would exceed your expectation, students identify a majority of the claims made in a text and list the majority of evidence and reasons that support them, 3 or more. You see how detailed that is? So if a student turned this in, you would know that it exceeds your expectations. But let's look at, oh my goodness, I keep doing that, below expectations. Students identify little or no claims, 1 claim or none, and or do not accurately list proper evidence and reasons that support their claims. So if you saw students only list 1 claim, or if they listed, even if they listed 2 claims, but the evidence was either made up or had nothing to do with the claims, that would be below your expectations. Does that make sense? The whole purpose of the criteria is to help you determine, if you are looking at all of your students' work, do they meet your expectation? It almost helps you sort them into 3 piles. Do they meet your expectation? Awesome, you can move on. Are they exceeding your expectation? You might want to take that you might want to take that pile of students' work and give them a challenge the next day. Or are they in the below expectations pile, where you might have to pull those few students and do a little reteaching for them because they haven't quite gotten it yet. I hope that makes sense to you. Okay, so I like to talk about rubrics at this point because when you think about criteria, especially how this is explained here, this is often shared with students in a rubric, if you think about it. So just to kind of everybody get on the same page about rubrics, a formal definition is a coherent set of criteria for students' work that includes descriptions of levels of performance quality on the criteria. That's very wordy, but ultimately what that's saying is, what criteria are you measuring, and how will you know their level of performance for each of those criteria? So the purpose of a rubric actually is not meant to be evaluative, even though, and I do it too, because like I've said, we live in a structure of having to use grades, but my purpose for the rubrics isn't evaluative per se. Well, it gives you a grade, but my purpose is to give you descriptive feedback, because what that does is then tell you what parts of this are you doing well on and what parts do you need work on. It also helps give structure to when you're just observing student performance. If you're just observing, you might notice uneven things between your students if you don't have like a solid set of criteria that you're looking at across all students. So let me also say, rubrics actually do 3 things, and I think a lot of these are forgotten. First of all, rubrics help teachers teach. If you think about it, you set your goals first, you determine what your assessment is, then you create your rubric to evaluate that assessment. So now what are you going to plan for your teaching? You're going to prepare students based on what you have on your rubric. You're not going to teach extraneous things, right? You're going to be really focused. Second is that they help coordinate instruction and assessment. I know that sounds very obvious, but I'm sure at some point in your career as a student, you've taken an assessment that you felt like had nothing to do with what you did in class. It happens, right? Well, rubrics help us avoid that. And third, rubrics help students learn. The whole purpose, like how I give you rubrics for all the assignments, that way you know what you need to do. It's not just about compliance or completing a task, but you know the skills that you need to use and the product that you need to produce. Okay? So there are two types of rubrics. One is analytic and one is holistic. I use analytic rubrics because they describe each criterion separately. Holistic is different. So this is an example of a holistic rubric. So you have levels of performance here, right? Unacceptable, weak, acceptable, yada, yada. But there aren't separate criteria. So if you were to read this entire thing, it addresses genre, definition, characteristics, examples used, bibliography, APA, well organized. Everything is in one. For some things, I guess that would be okay. There are some assignments, maybe you do want to look at them more holistically. But for me, this doesn't give you a good enough sense of where you need to go. Because if you, let's say, you included your whole bibliography of 10 books and they were correct APA formatting, but the characteristics or subcategories were identified or maybe even not identified well, like how are you going to know if I circle all of this? Do I circle all of this? If you missed one of the things, do I circle this? See how confusing that is for you, the student? That's why I use analytic rubrics. So I break my things down. Generally, you would just have this criteria column. I don't know, sometimes take it a step forward and have this additional one. But like in looking, this is for the assignment that'll be due at the end of the week. So in your assessment that you're going to create, I'm looking at three different things. I'm looking at the standards that you identified, the connection to the learning target, and then the strategy you used. So if you knocked it out of the park with standards and the connection to the learning target, but the strategy you chose, you kind of used incorrectly, well, I'm going to circle here and here, but then I'm going to circle over here. And you're going to be able to look at this and see, oh, I kind of missed the mark on the strategy, right? It gives you, the student, a very clear picture on what it is that you need to improve. Make sense? So when we think about developing a rubric, it is kind of a daunting task, but I like to tell people, first of all, keep it really simple because it's better for you in doing the work, but it's better for the student too because it just focuses their work better. But here's some general guidelines for when you're developing a rubric. So obviously, some of these things you're going to do as you're planning your lesson. You're going to unpack your standard, right, and have a learning target. Then you're going to write the assessment, whatever it is, which remember is probably the learning target, right? Just rewritten as a formative assessment, right? So you've done these two things. So then you're going to determine, okay, how many levels of performance do I want? Do I want it to be a 2-point rubric, a 4-point rubric? I would always stick with 3 or 4, maybe even sometimes 2. It depends on what you're looking at. Then you're going to say, well, what are the critical elements of the task? What exactly am I looking for students to do? And then once you figure that out, you've got your shell of a rubric, then you fill in all of the boxes. And then if you have to assign points, you do. But see how that's it's an afterthought. The purpose isn't the points per se. So what I mean is the first thing I do is, okay, I wanted this to be a 3-point rubric. 1, 2, 3 right here. And then I determine my criteria. When you develop your assessment, I really want to see that it comes from a standard, that it is tied to the learning target, and it uses a strategy well, right? So there's my skeleton. I have that and that. Then all you do is plug in the information in all of these boxes. So what does it mean to you to meet your expectation? Remember, you wrote this in your lesson plan, right? Didn't that come in here?